I am so honored to bring in two of our fantastic and recent additions to Python MVPs. Just to give a shout out to the MVP program and to these two lovely people that I know in real life, which is just amazing. So the MVP program is, you can find it at aka.ms/MVP. I'm just throwing this out there. We don't actually have a link for that. But they're very friendly on the internet, and I hope I'm not overstepping that you can find their socials and ask them what it's like to be a Python MVP. And all the great esteem and street cred that they get from being it. They're senior engineers in the space, and they'll be telling you more about deploying your Django application.
Yes, thank you for that introduction, Dawn.
Yeah, no problem. I'll get out your way. You introduce yourselves properly and lead us on our journey.
Awesome. So, hi, my name is Velda. I am a software engineer and a technical writer, as well as an open source contributor and one of the newest Python MVPs for web technologies as well. And I love working with Django, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Afi?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Abigail, or you could also call me Afi. I'm a software engineer on the back end, and I'm an open source contributor, and I'm also into partnerships, like tech and partnerships. So that's something about me. It's nice to have you all here, and we can't wait for you to see what we have in store for you.
Awesome. So let's get to it. So the first things first is we're going to go through our how to deploy your application. And the first session is the deployment session, which I'm going to go through. So there are two ways you can deploy your Django app. So firstly, you have seen in the previous presentation by Renee, thankfully, she used the Azure portal, but today we're going to use the CLI because I prefer using it because I'm fond of the terminal. So the first spot you should start with is definitely installation process. So if you're on macOS and you do not have it installed, you should update Brew, then install Azure CLI. If you have Azure CLI already, you could just upgrade it to ensure that you get the latest update of the Azure CLI. In Windows, you would have to start up PowerShell as an administrator and then run this particular command. After running this command, hopefully everything went well and you didn't get any errors. You should actually be able to type in AZ, that is AZ or AZ.-help to see if you have actually installed it. And additionally, once all the installation is complete, you can verify the installation through the Azure version command. So in this particular code, I am using Azure CLI. The version is 2.67.0, which is the version of my Azure and my Azure CLI. And it also shows you all the extensions that come with it. But right now, I do not have any additional extensions. Once you're all set up, you want to now log in to Azure itself so that you have access, so that when you deploy your application, you can actually have access to the portal as well. So this is going to bring a pop-up of authentication process. And once you log in, it's going to redirect you to your default browser. Then you're going to see, after you're authenticated, it's going to show you this particular pop-up. And then whether you're redirected or not, you can click the Azure CLI documentation link and you can get yourself learning how to use Azure with a lot of documentation there. So now that we have Azure CLI already set up, we want to ensure that our Django applications are up and running. And that's why we have the Django checklist. I used white noise because it allows you to serve static files directly from your Django app in a production environment. So it's a Python library that is very common and that is also used to serve this particular purpose. And I use pip install white noise. Once you have installed white noise, you also need to add the middleware settings so that Django understands that, hey, we have this, and this is supposed to collect our static files. And then you also want to define this particular line because this is where your static files are going to be stored. Once this is all done, the point of actually setting up this and having the static file storage is it ensures that it can persist when you deploy your application so you don't end up losing your static file. Next is our requirements.txt file. If you do not have an existing one at this point after you installed White Noise, you could easily create one manually, or you could use pip freeze greater than sign requirements.txt, which is basically pip freeze tells pip to collect all your requirements and add them to your txt file. If you don't like using pip freeze, you could use pip list, which lists all the different packages in your file, in your terminal, and then you could copy paste that to your requirements file. Remember that the requirements file goes to your root project, to the root, like it goes to the root folder of your project, I tend to use pip list because then I don't have to keep on worrying about using pip freeze and some other complications that come up. But the important thing is to ensure that your requirements.txt file is set up. It doesn't matter how you get there, just ensure it's there, because this is what Azure is going to be reading to see what packages you're using so that it can actually deploy your app. Next up, you need to also add the name of the website that you're going to be using on your settings.py file on the allowed host. This is so that after you deploy, you can actually see your site and not get a bad request error. If you don't do this, you will definitely get a bad request error because it's not one of the names defined in your allowed hosts. And then something else is, since we're using Azure, it doesn't matter whether you provide the name now or later on. If you provide it later on, you'd have to come back and add your name or the name that you choose to your allowed host and then deploy again, which is a nuance at some level. So you'd rather just use a particular name that you can follow through the whole time. That's why I went with Azure Python Day, because today is Azure Python Day. And as always, you have to include the rest of the URL as well. Now, to actually serve our static files, you need to ensure that you have defined your static files in your settings.py file. This is just logistics to confirm that you have the static files here, the URL, and the directory, as well as the storage that we actually set up. Once you have confirmed that your static file settings are okay, you can now officially run python manage.py collect static. This is going to create a production environment for the static files, and it's also going to be included in your application. You'll see it automatically generated. And the last thing is definitely change your debug settings to false, because we do not want everybody seeing what's going on in your logs or release any sensitive information. And the final step, the exciting step, is you get to now deploy. So this is the command I used to deploy this particular app. And the commands here are listed as, the first line is the name, which is the name of the application we defined in the allowed host. We also have runtime that defines a version of Python that we're using. I'm using Python 3.12. SKU refers to the basic service plan that you're using. I chose this because it's a basic level service plan and the application is not heavy and doesn't have a lot of traffic. And then we also have the logs that prints the logs in your console. So this command basically creates the resource group, adds the service plan, adds the name of the application, and then zips the deployment. So what does it look like after you have run this particular command? This is what starts to appear in your terminal. It's going to zip the contents of your file based on wherever the location of your file is. It's going to zip it, and then it's going to start building. Once it's successfully built, it's going to give you a URL that you could easily go to see if your deployment is successful. Sometimes it may take a couple of minutes before it loads, so don't worry. And now, since the application is deployed successfully, you can easily see what the application does. So this application has a homepage, which is the Azure Developers Python Day, and it displays characters from the movie animation, actually, from Atlantis, the Lost City by Disney. If you'd like to see how this app actually works and the code base and everything that I've used to present this particular code right now, you could scan this URL. And if you want to see how the app actually behaves in your own machine, you can easily use this URL. Just go to azurepythonday.azurewebsites.net. Now, the next session, I'm going to be introducing Afi, who's going to be taking us through the documentation session.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you so much, Velda. So I promise it's not going to be boring because I know most devs don't like technical documentation, but as a software engineer or someone who writes code, there should be good documentation for the code you write. Velda took us through the first part, which is letting us use Azure CLI to deploy a web app, which is based in Django. So moving on, we are going to look at certain things to look at when we create documentation for the code we write. So we're going to document our deployment process, and I'll be giving you certain tips and tricks because with every tool you create, you have to document all those things. So before we started, Velda took us through Azure CLI, and just rehashing, we know Microsoft Azure provides us with tools and services and storage and VMs, as seen in the previous session, right? So the Azure CLI tool enables us to automate certain things, tags, create, manage resources. I was really happy in the previous session we saw her use the portal as opposed to the CLI, so that I get the best of both worlds. So in this session, Velda highlighted the use of the CLI. In the previous session, we saw the GUI, or the platform interface. So you ask, why document your deployment process? Why should we write? Why should we create feature technical documentations? Why should we write reports? Why is it necessary to have a high level or summary of the tools or resources we have deployed on Azure? Why should we even bother? Well, it helps with consistency because it helps everyone follow the same steps. In case you have to move from one team to another or to teach someone something you have deployed, it's easy for you to do that, and it makes it more consistent. Also for efficiency, because it streamlines your deployment process. When you have a process or procedure on how to go about certain things, it makes it very seamless. Also, it helps reduce the chances of errors. If Velda is supposed to deploy something, and I'm supposed to deploy something, and there's no document or, let's say, a little bit of guideline on how to go about it, you realize we may use different paths, right? So getting a deployment process or a documentation really helps you reduce the chances of errors. We may come across errors which we may collaborate with and go like, hey, I got this error. Did you get the same error? And we try and fix it. But when you have a document or, let's say, a blog or documentation like the Azure Docs, it reduces the chances of error, or actually helps you solve the errors you face. Oh, great. And also for auditing. So when you document processes at work or on your app or your side project, you realize that you may face certain hurdles that you overcome. It's good to document those things, especially with deployment, so that it's easy to roll back or reapply. You see, in case you need to troubleshoot or check the logs or make sure everything is all right, or to go to a previous stable version. So it's good for auditing too. Now, moving on to the tools for documentation, you wonder, aside from Medium and certain blocks, what are other things we can use to document our deployment processes? So for Azure, there's a tool called the Azure Documenter in Turbo 360. It gives like a high level view of the resources and tools you use and how much they're consuming. So you could sort of track it. And you could either use this as a summary or add a screenshot or the information into a document if you are providing a report to your team. So that's one. The Azure boards, I know we are really used to Jira boards to track tasks, but listen, it could also help you outline the deployment process because you see, when we use a Kanban board or the Azure board, you list all the tasks in a sequential order and then you end up moving them. So Azure boards could be a way for documenting your deployment process. And that one is open to the whole team. So everybody knows what's yet to do, in progress, and done. And then the third one is publishing sites. That one we are all used to it because we use Medium, .dev, we use platform engineering blogs, GitHub pages, and GitHub gist. So these are all types of things that we could use to document our processes. Great. So this is an example of what I was saying with a high-level view. And yes, so it gives you a summary of the resource groups, resource types, locations across which the resources are distributed, and also a billing summary because you need to track how much you're spending. I know there are thresholds to see how much not to go above a certain threshold, but if you have a summary of the months and how much you spend, it will help make a more informed decision for the rest of the year or for the years ahead. So yeah, I think we saw this already. So this is like a snapshot of the action, the count, and the cost incurred. So this is just an example that I saw. So based on the web apps, alert management, application insights, you can see the count and then the cost. These are very important when you are deploying an app because if you have an app that's costing thousands of dollars and you are not tracking it efficiently or documenting it, it becomes a problem because it's hard to see what you can do to mitigate or make things easier or where the money is going or what resource you have to limit or what resource you have to put more money into. So now we're going to look at the key components of deployment documents. It could be in different forms, but there are certain things that must necessarily stand out. So overview, the purpose of the document, as I said, is to put certain things that are necessary for your deployment process inside for your team or for yourself or for anyone who needs that information. So the target environment could be the dev environment, prod or staging. In a previous example, I think Velda used the prod environment. Also, it highlights the application or service being deployed, which in this case is the Azure Python Devs Day, right? And then the deployment frequency. How many times do you deploy in a week? Mostly people tend to deploy once in 2 weeks, bi-weekly, or probably about once in a week. So it depends. All those things have to go inside the document. Yep. So, but deployment, right? There's pre-deployment, there's deployment, and post-deployment. These 3 stages are really crucial because they inform how the deployment is going to go. There's a saying that goes like, without proper preparation, right? Things are bound or likely to fail. So with pre-deployment, you have code review and testing, which is mostly done by QA. But software engineers are supposed to test their code before pushing it to QA. That's the actual right way. Then you have the configuration changes, which is normally in the form of a config file, right? Where you declare your jobs and then the batches and all those things which are going to run. Also, if you have database updates, all those things are done in the pre-deployment stage before you push the code. So with the deployment, we have the code deployment itself, with what Velda showed, it was done with GitHub Action. So the code was hosted on GitHub and then we run the pipelines. You can move on. Yeah, with the configuration deployment, it still talks about the config file that you use, which is in the form of a YAML file. And then the database deployments, because you make changes to the database and then you restarting or reloading the services to update it after you've made that deployment. So in the end, after preparing well and deploying, there's the part where you have to see if what you've done is the right thing or the wrong thing or what has changed, and that's the verification. So you have to see how it functions, whether the performance has increased or decreased, optimizations that could be applied, right? And if it comes to a very not bad, but worse or unexpected change, you could roll back. Django is really, really good with rollback. So if you run a migration and you want to roll back, yeah, there's rollback like strategies that you could use once you have your migration files intact. The tools that we use in this presentation is the Azure CLI, as we already said, or you could use the app service. Personally, the CLI is really cool because you just run one line and it just works. But you could also use the app service, which is also great. The deployment tools, aside Azure, you could use Jenkins, Ansible, GitHub Actions, Puppet. Then with the IAC, which is infrastructure as code, as in the configuration deployment files I mentioned in the YAML form, that one you could have it in Terraform, CloudFormation. You could have it in different forms. Once it's just a configuration file. Also to monitor, Azure already has Azure Insights, which gives you insights into the app you've deployed. But outside Azure, you also have Prometheus and Grafana. Ooh, so this is where people tend to shift blame, because when things go wrong, as I was saying, it has to be specified in the document who is responsible for each step for a particular process, who approves deployment, who is going to be on call after work hours for support, because things could go wrong. Your Azure resource could go down, things could be slow. There should be someone who will be there after hours to handle or solve these situations. Mostly, companies have something called a playbook. A playbook is similar to a deployment document, but it specifies certain rules that you should take when a particular action happens. So considering having a playbook and a deployment document is very, very good to make sure that your services and your resources are always up and running. Also, you saw Velda showed a Django checklist. So these are the checklists I should have with the deployment documents. The pre-deployment, as I said, the deployment itself, and then the post-deployment. Okay, so now we've gotten to this part that I'm just going to talk a little bit about it. So when you have the code residing in a repo, right, and it's being pushed to Azure, then it's built and then it's released. So the release pipeline is where the CI/CD comes in. And when you deploy, it goes through the stages. So testing whether it's accepted, and then it goes into production. So in these stages, there are different checks that make sure that the thing you've pushed, whether it's the configuration file, the database changes, or your resources are being configured and it's in the right way. Also, in another similar fashion as Velda did, you have the GitHub repo, the Azure pipeline build, and then the release. So when you're creating in the app service in the previous demo, I think Renee was showing where you create an app, a web app. There's an opportunity to add a pre-deployed app and authorize GitHub in there and select the repo when your name appears. So that's also another option if you don't push from Azure repo. So these are the references I use for this and then the testing, and it's nice to talk to you and let you go through the process of documentation when it comes to your deployment process. Thank you so much for listening to me, and have a good evening. It's evening here, but good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are.
Yeah, good morning. Don, you're muted.
I did it again. It is all over the world. We just were talking to Renee, and it was morning time where she was. And thanks so much for staying up so late to give us a great presentation. We were in the chat talking about how wonderful the graphics were. I'll give a couple of minutes to see if the people who are in the chat have more questions. But I have a question for you all. So you both are prolific speakers and contributors, volunteers in your respective communities. And I know that's one of the reasons why I think we were able to be connected, and we're such a great fit for the Python MVP program. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you got involved or the value that you've seen in your career by getting involved in the community, and maybe how, I know you're both new to the MVP program, but how you may want to invite people in who might be interested in the MVP program. And we'll start with you, Velda.
Could you repeat? These are like 3 questions.
I know. So just talk around it, right? So mostly of the MVP program and being involved in the community, how does that serve you in your career?
Oh, yeah. So I started off writing code in open source. So I was accustomed to like, this is what people do. Like once you get in, you use the space or you use the technology and then you give back to the technology in different forms. That could be writing code, right? Going to meetups, organizing. Like there's so many ways that you could contribute that are not like specifically in code. And yeah, I have done most of these things. I have written code, I have organized, I have spoken in all these local and international events. I have done all that. And the beauty of all this is that you get to meet people like Don and Afi and hang out with people and get to learn what they know. Like you can have 1,000 people in one room and have 100,000 more of what they know. And you could learn all this through just a conversation, even asking questions. And so what I would say is once you're coming into this space, be open, ask questions. People are always ready to help you. And there's so many resources also available to you. And in your own way, you could also figure out how to give back to the community that also serves you. And it also helps because now that you're also visible, like people can see what you're doing, you can get access to more opportunities, and opportunities are good things. So yeah, it's a win-win situation. And also for the MVP program, I love that we have different discussions there where we're talking about whether it's a deployment gone wrong or what you need help with, because that happens a lot. Even when I was doing this presentation, I had like 5 more steps, but then I was like, wow, I didn't realize that you could actually deploy with just one line. Previously, I was creating the app, doing the resources, then adding everything else that I need. And then I think I posted it on the chat and somebody was like, oh, actually, you can accomplish this in this one line. I was like, ooh, countless nights, but I got there eventually. So yeah, it's exciting. And I don't know how to invite people to the MVP program. Basically, I don't know how that's supposed to work, honestly. But yeah, I believe once you find people who also are already involved, it's easier to get probably a recommendation through that. So, but there's a catch. You also need to have done like solid community work because that's going to be part of the application process. And if you don't meet that, then even if you get recommendation from people in Microsoft or GitHub, it's not gonna work, right? You need to have work to back up your application. So I would say continue doing the work that you're doing, continue making yourself visible, get access to MVPs. We're actually everywhere, and most of the MVPs I've met are really nice and cool people. So you don't have to be afraid of anything.
Great.
Yeah,
And
that's
I did
great.
ask like 4 questions. I asked 3 and then I asked another one. So Abigail, you can pick which of the 4 questions you want to answer, or
Okay,
all of
so
them if you want.
well, I would say for the MVP program, as Velda said, yeah, put in a lot of work into community and also your personal, let's say, career. Try and always make sure that you are upskilling at every point. And also, I got into volunteering, and I met Velda about 4 to 5 years ago. I didn't know I would meet her again. We met at the Google Sub-Saharan conference for leaders with Google Developers Group, and I didn't know I would meet her 3 years or 4 years after. So the people you meet on your way up are the same people you meet on your way down. Be nice to people, be open. Some of us are naturally shy. I understand. Like it's really hard walking up to people and talking and hey, I do this, I do that. You want your work to speak, but try and have people skills. It will take you really, really far. So yes, just keep killing it, putting yourself out there, and yeah, more of him.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. You were both the last presentation of the day, and we're an awesome boost of energy despite how late it is where you are. Thank you so much. And I appreciate your contributions.
Awesome. Thank you for
Thank
having
you
us.
so much.